Hi. Wow, I actually can't see anything but smoke, so I'm going to just pretend you're all there, because actually imagining is what I do for a living, so that's okay. I am, as my husband likes to say, a professional liar. My agent thought visionary wordsmith was a kinder way of saying it. So I'm going to talk about words and stories today. And I want you to imagine for a minute what it would be like to have a perfectly happy life in which nothing ever went wrong. Now I want you to imagine how boring that would be if you read it in a book. Without polarity, there's no story. Now, life, of course, also has a habit of throwing out lots of polarities, which, is probably good, or we have to decide it is. Stuff happens, we have to deal with it. And we don't always deal with it quite as neatly as we do in fiction, but we do have to deal with it, come to terms with it in some way, and ideally thrive again. Part of that, I think, is working out who we really are, our sort of innermost self, so that when times are bad, we can remember that we're the same person as we are when times are good. And it doesn't always feel like that. I do want to say up front, I'm not someone who says, you need to have trauma to discover who you really are. I think trauma's highly overrated. You deal with what happens. There is nothing wrong from learning from joy and wonder. But my story has a bit of polarity. So in 1991, when I was an occupational therapist, a mother of two, a farmer's wife, and a fledgling author, I was driving my son to karate when a car went through a give-way sign at 140 kilometers an hour and hit my side door. So I had a fractured second vertebra of my neck, which is commonly known as a hangman's fracture. I had a fractured skull, I had 2 broken ankles, a shattered left heel, a shattered left thumb, severe concussion, disrupted vestibular balance systems, and a few other neurological things. Medical opinion is really skeptical about near-death experiences, but what I know is that I felt myself going up. Actually, I described it as a pipe. So the classic interpretation is a tunnel, but it was so tight and squeezy, I described it as a pipe. And I was going up it. I could see down at this body that had been me. I heard my inner voice say, "The stuffing's come out." And really shouting, "I don't want to die." And then as I was coming out into that so often described beautiful white light, I looked down what seemed to be from a great height and saw my son sitting on the ground. He'd broken the window and climbed out of the car, which they believed was going to explode. And he was being comforted by a very kind woman, I'm sure, in a red cardigan. I cannot describe the rage I felt. Nobody but me was going to look after my son. And I slipped back down that tunnel into the mess of body, pain, and life. So, 25 years on, I can do most things that I want. But when I was told that I would never be able to go for a walk again, I could walk. After a few years, they said maybe my limit had probably been reached with walking about 100 meters with a stick. I would never wear women's shoes because I had to have a big orthotic, and I'm just showing you now. And that apart from, ever riding or skiing, don't wrap yourself up in cotton wool, but don't do anything silly. You must never cross a street on your own. I really had to wonder who I would be for the rest of my life, because it seemed that all my roles had been stripped away. And although in theory, of course, I was still a mother, but for a long time, my children were putting on the frame that held my neck up. They were helping me dress. My husband was helping me with things we prefer your husbands not to help you with. My mother moved out from Canada and did all the housekeeping and everything. So I felt that I had actually lost all my roles, as well as obviously being an occupational therapist. So I felt that I had to dig deep into myself and find the stories of who I was. I can actually remember this decision. I have to really figure out who I was when I was sort of like a strong child. And I really went back to that. I read a lot of children's books again. The books that I felt had helped make me me. I read a lot in French because French was the language I learned to read in, and it was my first language for friendships and relationships outside the home. So it was a strong story of who I was. But the other story I felt that I could think of reclaiming was being a writer. It was a while before I was actually strong enough to write again, but I had two bits of luck. And one was that I had started a new book the morning of the accident. So the shape of it was off there in ether space, waiting for me. The second bit of luck was that the book I had just finished was actually published a year later, and in 1993 it was shortlisted for the Children's Book of the Year award. And honestly, the symbolism would be far too shonky to use in fiction. I heard the news of the shortlist an hour after I cleaned out my office, having finally accepted that I would not ever be returning to my work as an OT. So, I'm going to rephrase that. Reframing editing is what I do a lot of. One of the writer's favorite words is what if. And something that I kept thinking from the start was, what if the car had hit the passenger side door instead of the driver's? That was the wrong arm, wasn't it? And if my son had been injured instead of me, because he actually had a cut on his head, which they gave him one stitch, and that was it. It really doesn't bear thinking about, but of course I'm a mother, so I thought about it a lot. And so a few years later, I gave my accident to a teenage girl. And it wasn't actually as cathartic as people always think it would have been. But when I had readers' responses from around the world, people who felt that my fiction had really validated their experiences of trauma, which really varied widely. They weren't all broken necks. Their responses in turn validated me and helped in my healing. But most of my books since then have come, I think, from that deep channeling of my childhood self. And one of these was the memory of sitting on a ferry, going to Vancouver Island to visit grandparents and thinking, I want to live in a little island all by myself. And so the 9-year-old went home and filled 2 notebooks with a story, and the 40-year-old actually wrote Nim's Island. And this was the book that an independent Hollywood producer picked up, and she wrote to me and said, I started reading it to my son, and then my daughter came in, and my husband, and the 2 fat cats. Please understand, I'm inquiring about the film rights. So 5 years later, it became the first Australian children's book to become a Hollywood feature film. Jodie Foster saw the script early on. She gave her son the book. She told me it was the book that made him into a reader, and she wanted the part. And she said later, had to knock on the door a couple of thousand times. It's hard to believe, but she did fight for it. She got the part, and then, of course, we got all these wonderful people wanting to come on with her. It was absolutely surreal 5 years later to be driving down Hollywood Boulevard in this flood of blue and green island ticker tape, and then actually walking the red carpet at Grauman's Chinese Theatre. It was surreal, it was overwhelming, and it was really hard to believe I was the same person that had been told 17 years earlier that there was no point in rehabilitation because I wouldn't ever work again. But presuming none of you are actually going to plan to break your necks, please, although I did meet somebody in a workshop this morning who also had, what relevance does it have to you? And I think stories are really relevant. So I have a theory, which is going to be super quick, and I'm going to do a little exercise. If you could please pull out your journals or anything to write on, just really quickly. And I want you to jot down this young woman's greatest fear and greatest desire. But I want you to hold your pens in your non-dominant hand. So left hand for most of you. And so don't overthink it. Just, we have time actually for you to do one word for each. But I really need you to write it with that non-dominant hand. So I'm going to be quiet, and remember, there are no quizzes at the end, no right and wrong answers. Can you just write down what you believe this girl's greatest fear is and her greatest, and her greatest desire? As I said, there's no quiz, it's just a little game. But this is a technique that I used a lot, especially in my latest book, to interview my characters. The reason for using the non-dominant hand is that it seems you're bypassing the inner critic a little bit more with your non-dominant hand. And I found that doing this with my latest book, I found that her answers sometimes surprised me. Or as a grade 9 girl said in a workshop, I didn't know I was thinking about that. So the more you access your subconscious, I believe, in writing, the more writing fiction and reading fiction, which was what I also wanted to talk to you about, that is how we build up resilience and empathy, playing with being in somebody else's life, the curiosity of how we could live our lives differently. We build up a reservoir of stories that we can pull on, that we can call on to help us find different ways of being ourselves. I had an email last week from an 18-year-old girl in Turkey who started writing to me as a 13-year-old NIM fan. And she said, I'm preparing for the university and I'm traveling and, of course, reading. And then she gave this long explanation of the problems in Turkey and said, I feel really sad that some people are going through all this and I'm just reading. But what else can I do? I say that girl is doing exactly what she should be doing. She's building up the stories of how to look at other people's lives, and who knows what she'll accomplish. So I'd like to encourage you all to pick up a book, enhance your own curiosity, your resilience, enhance your lives, and because life is full of ups and downs, dreams can turn to nightmares in the blink of a careless eye. But turning nightmares back into dreams requires some work, some time, and some stories. So thank you.